and introduce myself. I am Jen Armstrong, the Director of Alumni Engagement here at Monmouth College, and welcome to Wearing Politics on Your Sleeve, a visual history of the U.S. political campaign button. We are thrilled to be here tonight with Brad Nahrstadt. He has amassed a collection of over 1,600, I think close to 1,700 presidential campaign buttons, spanning every election from 1896 to the present. He acquired his first presidential campaign button because of a political science class here at Monmouth College with Professor Ira Smolinski. Brad graduated summa cum laude from Monmouth College in 1989 with a Bachelor of Arts degree in English Literature and Political Science, and graduated with departmental honors in both his major fields of study. Upon graduating, he enrolled at University of Illinois College of Law, and after graduating from U of I, he spent his legal career serving at a few prestigious Chicago law firms, and is the award-winning author of over 90 legal articles and 35 book chapters. He retired from the practice of law in December 2019, and in January 2020, he began serving as the Chief Operating Officer of Donahue Brown, Mathewson and Smith, a 40-lawyer litigation firm in Chicago. We are grateful that Brad has served his alma mater in many ways. From 1995 to 2000, he was a member of the Monmouth College Alumni Board, and he served as president of that group from 98 to 2000. In 2002, he was elected to the Monmouth College Board of Trustees, in a position he holds to this day. We are also very thankful to Brad's film director and producer and wife, Deb Nahrstadt, also a class of 1989, who is running the iPad for us tonight. And most of these names I see here have been to one of these before, but I just want to remind everyone, if you have questions or comments, please type them in the chat feature, and make sure you choose the all panelists and attendees so everybody can see what you're saying. And we appreciate Brad and Deb for volunteering to lead tonight's presentation. I can't wait to see it. So Nahrstadt, take it away.
Thanks, Jen. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to what I hope will be an interesting discussion about the history of the American political campaign button, how they got started, how they've been used. I'll give you a tour of the collection, starting with the earliest buttons I have, which are from the election of 1896, all the way up to the present day. You'll see that I have a frame full of Biden buttons and a frame full of Trump buttons. And before we get started, I'm sure you're probably wondering, I'm standing here, these don't look like buttons. And that's absolutely correct. These are the oldest campaign posters that I have. They're for the Republican candidates for president and vice president in 1892. So Benjamin Harrison and Whitelaw Reid. Up until 1892, if you were looking to actively support a candidate, this is what you would have. You would go to the campaign headquarters, pick up a poster or two, put the poster on your fence, put it in your front window. There were some other items that were often used in those times before the election of 1896, campaign canes, which usually had the head of the candidate as the knob of the cane. There were banners and sashes that people would wear. There were a relatively small number of actual wearable items. There were in the 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, there were daguerreotype badges and ferrotype badges, which were little metal objects that you could wear on your lapel pinned to your coat that had the precursors of modern day photographs on them. There were sulfide badges, which were little glass badges that had an image, usually of the candidate or something associated with the candidate, in sulfide underneath the glass. And so that would be sandwiched together, and you would wear that again on your lapel or on your coat. There were the original campaign buttons. When George Washington was running for president, they literally gave away clothing buttons. So they were brass coat buttons with GW on it for George Washington. Those were the first campaign buttons. all of that changed. And you can still find a lot of, even after 1892, posters, broadsides, sashes, not so much sulfide badges and ferrotypes and daguerreotypes. They went out of style by 1896, but everything changed. The whole political landscape, campaigning changed in 1896. That was the first year that political campaign buttons existed. And if my camera woman will follow me this way, you will see these are two frames from the 1896 election. And what made this possible was the invention of a substance called celluloid. And celluloid was basically a precursor to plastic. It could be a clear material that they would form into a sheet and put over top of the paper backing that had the image that was what the button was supposed to look like. So before I dive into the whole collection and talk, a little bit about terminology, let me tell you, and Jen alluded to it, how this collection started. When I was a junior at Monmouth in the fall of 1988, it happened to be an election year, and I was taking a class called Party Politics and Elections. And one of the requirements for that class was you had to put in at least 15 hours on a campaign. It could be any campaign. It could be a national campaign, could be a local campaign. There were a number of kids in the class that worked for somebody who was running for alderman in Monmouth. And I decided I wanted to do something different. I wanted to see if I could work for the national campaign of Michael Dukakis. So the professor who was running that class, Iris Malinsky, was very good friends with the individual who was the chair of the Democratic Party in the Quad Cities, in Rock Island, Moline, Bettendorf, and Davenport. So I went up to see him and told him I was interested in volunteering. And he basically got us introduced to Dukakis's advanced staff, the people who go ahead of the candidate to set up events. And he was going to have a rally at the Rimco Exhibition Center in Rock Island. And they asked if we could, myself and two other kids from the class who went with me, if we could help them set up that rally. So we did. We spent 3 days, basically 3 days and nights, building a stage, building a way for Dukakis to come in, building a way for him to go out, hanging this huge banner in the background that had a picture of rolling cornfields and trees and such. And we came back on the Saturday of the rally, helped them pass out T-shirts and posters for people to hold up in the audience. And our only payment, we weren't getting paid for this, was a handful of buttons. And that's really how this whole thing started. Obviously, you know the outcome. Dukakis lost. It was not an easy loss for me, given the amount of time that I put into the campaign. I took those buttons and I basically threw them in my desk drawer at home and didn't think about them again until I was in law school. And I was home for a break and I was looking for something in my desk drawer and I found the Dukakis buttons. And I thought, I was able to, stifle the hurt in his loss by that point in time, and it brought back some fond memories. And I thought, maybe I'll see if I can find some things to add to this. And it turns out that my mother, who was a big fan of John Kennedy, she had a Kennedy button that she had kept since 1960, and she gave it to me, and that is really how this whole thing snowballed. And then it just became, I'm going to just start collecting, and it started as collecting anything I could. And then I decided that was probably not a good strategy. So I would have to, I'd have to change my collection focus. And so what I decided to do was to try and collect a frame, a shadow box, for each candidate who ran for president of the United States who received electoral votes. And there have actually been, so you might think, okay, well, that's going to be the Democrat and the Republican. There have been 5 instances from 1896 to the present where a third party candidate has actually received electoral votes. So you'll see when we go around the collection, there are 3 instances in which there are 3 frames, because there is a frame of buttons for the third-party candidates who got electoral votes. Now, if you were paying attention, you might say, well, Brad, you said there were 5. Why do you only have 3 frames? So the 5 candidates who got electoral votes, the first one to do it was Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. The next person to do it was Robert La Follette, a senator from Wisconsin, in 1924. Strom Thurmond actually got electoral votes in 1948 when he split from the Democratic Party over the issue of segregation. And there are 3 buttons known in the hobby for Strom Thurmond's campaign in 1948. I have them, but they're not on the wall because they would look kind of silly in a frame, you know, of this size. So they're upstairs in a separate container that I have. Robert Byrd actually got electoral votes in 1960. There are no buttons that were produced for Byrd's 1960 run. Again, he bolted from the Democratic Party to run for president. And then the last person to do it was George Wallace in 1968. When I show the collection to people, they always say, well, how come you don't have any Ross Perot buttons in your collection? And the answer is because although Ross Perot got several tens of millions of votes, he did not receive a single electoral vote. So Ross Perot is not in this collection. So let me tell you a little bit, go over some terms that you might hear me use during the rest of the talk, so you'll understand what it is that I'm talking about. There are basically 2 types of buttons. There are celluloid buttons, also called cellos, and there are lithographed buttons, also called lithos. Okay, so a celluloid button, this is an example of a celluloid button. It's basically used to, the covering used to be celluloid, it's now plastic. But the button is created by taking a metal back with a pin in it, putting a paper disc on top, putting the piece of plastic over it, and then crimping it at the back. And that gives you a celluloid button. The other kind of button, lithographed buttons, are basically just a piece of metal. They used to be tin, now they're usually steel. And the image is either silk screened or inked on the piece of metal, stamped out, crimped, and then a pin is placed in the back. So that's a litho. Those are the two types of buttons that you will basically see from 1896 forward. There are, in some instances, celluloid studs, and you'll see a bunch of them for the 1896 campaign, and there's some down here for William Jennings Bryan. And basically what that is a celluloid button, but on the back there's a stud so you can fit it through your lapel, the buttonhole in your lapel. Back in this time frame, when gentlemen went out, they always wore a coat. So instead of having something stuck in your clothes and leaving a hole, you could use the natural hole that was in the lapel and stick the stud in. That really went out of fashion after the first couple of elections, after they invented the button, because people weren't really wearing coats, required to wear coats that much anymore. There are mechanical buttons. And in the very first election where they had them, you can see this button right here is a mechanical button. And basically what happens is when you press down on the top, it says, I'm sure he will win. And when you push down on the top, it either shows a picture in the bottom of William Jennings Bryan. And if that's who you were for, that's who you would keep it on. And if you were for McKinley, you could push it again and the picture of McKinley would come on. So that's an example of a mechanical button. There's a couple other mechanical ones down here. These are some of my favorite. It's probably going to be hard to tell this, but this one with the donkey and this one with the elephant down here are both mechanical buttons. There's a string on the nose of the donkey and a string on the nose of the elephant. And when you pull the string, the elephant's back legs kick up to kick the donkey, and the the donkey's back legs kick up to kick the elephant. So that's another example of a mechanical button.
There's a question.
Yep.
And the question is, pre-George Washington, were there any political buttons for, say, House of Burgess elections?
I am not aware of buttons before George Washington's campaign. I'm not saying that they could not have been made. If they were, it would have again been a clothing button. It would have been a brass button, an actual, something you could sew on your coat that you could use to keep the coat closed, that would have had the candidate's initials on. That's really the only thing that existed at the time that Washington ran. And then as the technology advanced, as we got, daguerreotypes and ferrotypes and sulfide and all those materials, then they started making things that would be, I would say, the precursor to the modern day button. But I'm not aware, I haven't seen anything earlier than George Washington. And Washington, there's a couple different variations, but there are very few that were even made for Washington. So let's go back to the beginning of the collection again for a minute. And I'll tell you about another couple of terms that I want you guys to know about. So if there are two candidates pictured on the face of a button, and usually that would be the presidential candidate and the vice presidential candidate, that is called a Jouget. So this is an example of one right here, this button of William Jennings Bryan and his vice presidential running mate, John Kern. That's a Jouget. If there are three candidates pictured on the button, that's called a Trigate. And there is an example of that right here. This button from when Charles Evans Hughes ran shows Hughes along with someone who was running for senator and a Republican candidate for governor. So that's called a Trigate. So buttons come in many different sizes, from the smallest, which are these studs, which are about 7/8 of an inch, all the way up to, so you have 7/8 of an inch, 1 inch, 1 1/4 inch, 2 1/4 inch, 3 inch, 3 1/2 inch, 6 inch, all the way up to 9 inches. And I'll take you over here to show you. This is one of the 9-inch buttons. This was for Wendell Willkie's campaign in 1940. Now, the interesting thing about these 9-inch buttons, they do have a pin on the back. So it would be possible for you to pin that to your shirt, probably rip the front of the shirt off, but you could pin it to your shirt if you wanted to. What's interesting about the large ones is that they have a pop-out easel on the back. And what people would generally do with these, instead of wearing them, they would pop the easel out on the back and then set this on their radio or put it in their front window so that people could see which candidate they supported. Let's go all the way back to the beginning again, because I want to talk a little bit about how these buttons can show the issues in a campaign. So as we go around, you'll see that the campaign, the collection is organized in a specific way. It's winner on top, loser on the bottom, all the way around. If there was a third party candidate, they're not up top, they're off to the side, but they're down lower than the candidate who actually won. So that's anyone who ran for president and got electoral votes. Winner on top, loser on the bottom. That's essentially how this collection is put together. So themes, how can you look at the buttons and tell what the issues were that the candidates were concerned about, that the public was concerned about? The first election is actually one of the best ones to look at, because one of the big issues in the 1896 campaign was, is the US going to stay on the gold standard, or are they going to switch to the silver standard? So most of the buttons that were issued for McKinley have a gold background or have something to do with protectionism, protecting the gold standard. You see up here, there's a gold money bag. Most of the background of the McKinley stuff is gold. The background of the Jennings buttons, for the most part, were silver, because the Democrats' issue was we need to move to a silver standard instead of a gold standard.
There's a question that's come in from
Okay.
Mr. Nahrstadt.
Okay.
What election produced the best set of buttons?
Wow. That is a very tough question to answer. It's a tough question for me to answer because I have favorites from many different elections. And when we get to the more modern ones, I'm going to show you the button has been elevated to high art form. And I'll explain that when we get there. But the designs today are fascinating. I will tell you from a historical standpoint. So, and folks that specialize in collecting buttons will tell you from 1896 to approximately 1916, that is the golden age of political buttons. That's when the best designs came out. So you had amazing work like this one here, this William Jennings Bryan star button. You notice I have the Taft mate. That was the type of stylized design that took place. You also see on this Taft button how beautiful that one is. And this Taft button up at the top, how beautiful that is. This was really, this time frame was the golden age of button design. You'll see when we get a little bit further in the collection, I will point out that designs start repeating themselves. So they take designs that were popular back in this time frame and have used them again in the 60s, again in the 90s. So when I see designs that have repeated, I try to make sure that I get a representation of that so that you can see how that design has been used throughout the decades.
Before you continue, I just
Yep.
want to let you know that was from Dave from Riverside, California.
Oh, okay. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you, Dave. So 1896, gold and silver were the big issue. Here's the interesting thing. By 1900, the issue still hadn't been resolved. It was still a major part of both parties' platforms. So again, you will see that a lot of the Republican buttons have a gold background, and a lot of the Democratic buttons for Bryan have a silver background. I want to point out one very interesting thing before we move off the 1896 election. So this is as I said, the first election to have buttons, and the button in the middle of the frame, which is a button for William McKinley, they actually spelled his name wrong. So they produced all these buttons, and I don't know if you can see it, but they spelled his name Mackinley, and his name is actually Mckinley. That exact same button was reproduced for the 1900 campaign, and they actually spelled his name right on that one. So this is a very rare find, the one where they spelled his name wrong, because most people didn't keep it because his name was spelled wrong. So they threw it out, got rid of it. So that was an interesting one to come across and be able to add to the collection. So we've talked about 1896, 1900. What are some of the other issues that come up in the campaigns and the buttons? Let's talk about 1932, right? 1932, what was the big issue? Big issue was the Depression, right? Was the economic downslide that the country had gone through. So FDR, the mechanical one that I talked about before, kick out Depression with the Democratic vote. Interestingly, the Republican mate to that, the mechanical, says bring back prosperity with a Republican vote. Hadn't done so well up to that point in time, but that's what they decided to go with. And they talk about in the buttons, they talk about the issue of what are we going to do about this economic slump. In 1940, the big issue was FDR was running for an unprecedented third term. So most of the buttons that Willkie's campaign put out dealt with the fact that he was attempting to get elected for a third term. So there were all these slogan buttons that were produced by both sides. No campaign before or since has had so many slogan buttons put out for the candidates. And in this particular campaign, Wilkie was making a big deal out of the fact that Roosevelt was running for a third term. So you'll see lots of buttons that say things like 2 times is good enough for any man. Lincoln didn't, Washington wouldn't, Roosevelt shouldn't. No crown for Franklin, right? The argument being that Franklin Roosevelt wants to become a king. So those were his buttons, and Roosevelt responded in kind by saying things like, better a third termer than a third rater. Wilkie was a third-rate candidate. Wilkie for president of Commonwealth and Southern. He was actually the president of an electrical company, and that was a reference to that. 2 good terms deserve another. If it's Wilkie in the White House, it's US in the poorhouse. So they went back and forth with all these buttons, all these slogan buttons. What about the 1972 election? Big issue in 1972 was the fact that we were embroiled in Vietnam. So a lot of McGovern's buttons were about the fact that we needed to get out of Vietnam. So the slogan, "Come Home America," was directed towards bringing the troops home. This button right here, it says, "Come home and stop killing little babies." Sergeant Shriver for VP, McGovern for president. That button is very, very difficult to find because that slogan offended so many people that they actually took it out of production after only a relatively small number of them were made. So you see, as you're looking, you can see what the themes were, what the issues were. Let's talk about 1980. Here's something that people don't realize. Trump's slogan, obviously, right, is "Make America Great Again," MAGA, right? Well, he stole that. Ronald Reagan's slogan when he ran in 1980 was "Let's Make America Great Again." It's on a lot of the things that he put out. His idea at that time, remember, when he was running in 1980, there were gas shortages, inflation was out of control, the hostages were still in Iran. So he was saying, look, we've entered this general period of malaise and decline. Let's bring America, let's make America great again. And then that slogan obviously was co-opted by President Trump when he ran in 2016 and is still being used in 2020. So sometimes you look at the buttons and you can pick out the themes.
I have a question.
Yep.
What is the first time there were caricatures on buttons?
The first time there were caricatures on buttons. So I would not call this a caricature, but they started doing line drawings of the candidates in the 30s. The first time there were some, probably the first time it was used with great effect and predominantly was 1972. So you see here's George McGovern dressed up as Robin Hood. There was a whole series of buttons, both for every Republican who ran and every Democrat who ran, that was a caricature of them. Eugene McCarthy, Nixon, Nelson Rockefeller, Bobby Kennedy. Actually, back in '68, when Kennedy ran, there was a caricature button of him. You see in 1976, there is a matched pair, Carter Mondale caricatures for Dole caricature, and that has carried on through all the way up to the present time. So I would say it really came into vogue in the 70s, and then has been used with some success all the way through to the current. You'll see, I'm going to show you in a little bit the most current round of buttons that have some caricatures in them.
In 72, was there a McGovern Eagleton button?
Somebody knows their political history. Yes, there were a few of them, not many, and I'll point some of them out. This is a flasher, and it's very hard to tell. A flasher is a button where the pictures change. So this one is both for George McGovern and Thomas Eagleton. There's a McGovern Eagleton button here, McGovern Eagleton presidential team. And then there's a McGovern Eagleton button here, McG and Thomas Eagleton, 1972. Now, the interesting thing is Tom Eagleton was originally his vice presidential running mate. And after the convention, it came out that Eagleton had been treated for depression and had undergone electric shock therapy. So Eagleton withdrew from the team and they replaced him with Sergeant Shriver. So there are very few buttons that were made that had Eagleton on them because he was only the running mate for about 4 weeks. But there were a handful, and I've managed to get a couple of them. I wanted to show you again when you talk about how the campaign might not be a national theme, but it is a theme about the candidate themselves. So when Alf Landon ran in 1936, he was the governor of Kansas. The state flower of Kansas is the sunflower. So almost everything that was put out for Landon had a sunflower on it in some way, shape, or form. If you look over here in 1956, Adlai Stevenson was photographed at a campaign rally sitting in a chair with his legs crossed. And one of the things...
Sorry, I know you're there, but I think I lost you, so you're gonna have to give me a second. I think you're on, sorry.
Okay. Stevenson was photographed sitting on a stage with his legs crossed, and his shoe had a hole in it, big hole that you could see in the picture. So Eisenhower's campaign put out this button: "Don't let this happen to you. Vote for Ike," right, with a big hole in the shoe. And Stevenson decided, well, I don't think that's such a bad thing. He did his own. So it's just his crossed legs with the hole in the shoe for 56, right? If you think about Jimmy Carter, what do you think about? He was a peanut farmer. So when he ran in 1976, a lot of the things that were produced had peanuts on them. The grin will win. Jimmy Carter for president in 76. Here's a peanut with the top half is the Capitol Dome. Here's the peanut and Franklin County, Pennsylvania, depicted on the button. So you can see all the, looking at the various frames, what were the issues, who were the people that were running. Let's take a look at 2020, see what's been depicted in the buttons for this campaign election. So what's one of the big things that we're all thinking about and talking about? Coronavirus, right? So Biden's got a button. Here's Dr. Trump with a needle full of bleach as the COVID doctor getting ready to inject it into the baby. Trump put out a button where he says he's a wartime president. Pandemic, it's a war against an invisible enemy, and it's got a picture of the Red Cross ship in the background, Trump 2020. All right, so that's one of the issues. You see here again, make America great again, right? Keep America great. Here's a picture of Trump as Washington crossing the Delaware, and he's basically at the front of the boat, and it says Trump Pence continue to drain the swamp. Now, some would argue that the swamp hasn't been drained at all, but he's arguing continue to drain the swamp. Where does Trump get a lot of his support from? Here he is in front of a rebel flag, right? Christians for Trump 2020. I have a good one here. I had to get this one because I just can't believe how blasphemous it is. There's Jesus with a Make America Great Again hat on, holding an American flag. So you'll see those are, Biden, what does he got? Biden's got, here's Trump setting the Constitution on fire. Here's one, here actually is a repeat design, right? I showed you the one about Stevenson and his shoe. Don't let this happen to you. Vote for Ike. Well, this is one with, with Trump's picture on it. Don't let this happen to you. Vote for Joe. Some designs that have been repeated. These two buttons right here, this one here and this one here, are designs that were popular back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and they have redone them in order to make some, what I think are rather snazzy buttons for the 2020 campaign. I told you that designs repeat from time to time. So let's take a look at that. Here's this design for Stevenson and Kefauver. Vote straight Democratic ticket. Adlai Stevenson for president, Estes Kefauver for vice president. That design was used again when Bill Clinton and Al Gore ran. So here's the exact same design. It's a little bit bigger, but the exact same design. Vote straight Democratic ticket. Bill Clinton, president, Al Gore, vice president.
I have a new question.
Okay.
Has any other presidential candidate used religious symbols besides Trump?
Yes. Pat Buchanan, when Buchanan ran, he used a lot of religious symbols. I'm trying to think if there's anyone other than, so it's interesting. Let me bring you back over here to the election of 1928. So Al Smith, who was the Democratic nominee for president in 1928, was a Roman Catholic. He was the first Roman Catholic to actually win a major party nomination. And religion was a big issue in that campaign. People didn't talk about it a lot, although Herbert Hoover did produce a button that basically made a jab at Smith's religion. And it's this one right here. It may be a little hard to see, but it says a Christian in the White House. So the argument was, despite the fact that Al Smith was Roman Catholic, well, he wasn't Christian, right? So there was still at that time, there was still an awful lot of bias against Catholics. And so Hoover put out a button saying, look, you don't want, it didn't come right out and say it, but he said, you don't want a Roman Catholic in the White House, you want a Christian in the White House. So vote for Hoover. So that was a religious themed button. But in terms of religious symbolism, in terms of crosses, in terms of, man, I don't know that when Pat Robertson ran, he had some religious themed buttons. I don't know that anybody other than Trump put Jesus on their buttons. Actually, that's not true. Now that I think about it, I say that, and I don't know if I have it anymore because I think I rotated it out. But there was, yeah, it's not up here, but there was a Jimmy Carter button with Carter, a long beard on him and long hair made him look like Jesus in a robe, and it said, JC can save America. So that was a religious themed button saying basically, you know, JC made him look like Jesus and said that he was going to save America. I want to show you one more of the repeat designs because this happens to be one of my favorites. So when Taft and Sherman ran in 1908 on the Republican ticket, there was a button created called that in the hobby is called elephant ears. And it's basically the Republican elephant with his ears out and the pictures of the candidates on the ears. I don't have the Taft button. It is very, very hard to find, and it's probably outside my budget. So I don't have the Taft button, but that design popped up again in 1988, and it has been used by every Republican candidate with the exception of John McCain from 1988 to the present. So you can see here is the George Bush Dan Quayle 1988 version. Here is the George Bush Dan Quayle 1992 version, a little bit different because they started using square buttons in the 90s, and so they put the elephant ears on the square. Here's the 1996 Bob Dole Jack Kemp button. Here is the 2000 George Bush Dick Cheney elephant ears button. And you'll see the design is a little bit different each time, but it's the same concept. Here's the 2004 Bush Cheney elephant ears button. As I said, we don't have one for McCain in 08. For some reason, his campaign didn't do it. Here is the 2012 Mitt Romney and Paul Ryan elephant ears button. Here is the 2016 Trump Pence elephant ears button. And here's the 2020 Trump Pence elephant ears button. So the elephant ear has come through, has been a repeating design for the Republicans for at least 2 decades now. And when we were at the beginning, I said that that today buttons had become high art. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. So starting in the late 90s, there was an artist by the name of David Russell, and he creates one-of-a-kind buttons by cutting out and mixing images. So this 1996 Dole Kemp button is a David Russell original. And this Al Gore 2000 button is a David Russell original. So he does just a select number for candidates. Sometimes you can find them, sometimes you can't. We're talking about the question before about the high design, the period of high design. If you look at these 2 buttons from the 2000 race, Gore-Lieberman, this middle button, and then the one next to it, those are both designs from the golden age of buttons. And you see how beautiful they were. And they're starting to redo those designs and bring them back so that people can continue to enjoy them. Aside from David Russell, starting in the 2004 election, there's a gentleman by the name of Brian Campbell. He's an artist. That's what he does for a living. He will paint a full-size painting of a button concept and then shrink the artwork down to either 2 1/4 inch size or 4 inch size. He will make a limited number of each button and he will distribute them. And he has some of the best artwork on his buttons. So I happen to have a number of Brian Campbell buttons in my collection. This one here, George Washington and George Bush, that is a Brian Campbell button. It says, "First in war, first in peace, Bush, George W., 2004. He did the Bulldogs. Bush went to Yale, so the Yale Bulldogs. Bulldogs for Bush 2004. That's a Brian Campbell button. Down here in the carry frame, this one with American Gothic with Bush and Cheney, holding assault rifles. That's a Brian Campbell button. John Kerry got 3 Purple Hearts. So he did this button that Kerry is the King of Hearts. That's a Brian Campbell button. The Minuteman legacy, right? He's got Kerry dressed up as a Minuteman. That was a Brian Campbell button. And as you go through the elections, you'll see here he has, Campbell has John McCain dressed up as Indiana Jones, but he's Arizona John with some of the other candidates on there, Teddy Roosevelt and Reagan and Lincoln and Eisenhower. And up here, you'll see this is a Brian Campbell button. This is a picture of George Bush. McCain embraced Bush, and basically this is his Faustian deal with the devil. Bush embraced McCain.
I have some questions.
Okay, I'm ready for some questions.
The 1988 presidential campaign, 2 questions. How many hours over that 15 required your time did you work for Michael Dukakis?
More than 80.
Question 2, who was the chair of the Democratic Party that you worked with? Only reason I bring this up is that I worked with the Democrats in 1968 presidential campaign in Warren County. Mr. Robert Flanagan, most likely, rest in peace now, was the chairperson for the Warren County Democrats then.
Gary, his first name was Gary. I can't remember. And this was not the Warren County Democrats. This was the Rock Island County Democrats. So his first name was Gary. I cannot I want to say Peters. I think Gary Peters was his name. I know his first name was Gary. That's all I ever called him was Gary. So I remember Gary.
And I have a question. Does Brian Campbell need to get the party's permission to produce the buttons?
I'm going to say no. He doesn't. He doesn't get permission. I know he doesn't get permission. I think so. There are very few buttons that are actually issued by the campaign today. It's not worth their money, right? They put all their money into advertising on television, advertising on radio, now advertising on Facebook or other social media platforms. So they don't really spend a lot of money. It's often very difficult to find an actual campaign issued political button today. So most of what you see has been produced, so concept to production to sale, by third parties who are out there trying to promote the candidate that they support. So I know that the campaigns, I know Brian Campbell does not contact the campaign and say, hey, I'm going to put out this button, of John McCain looking like the outlaw Josie Wales, going after the Taliban with his 6-shooters. He does not ask for permission.
Another question that came in.
Yeah.
Women on buttons.
Yes.
Where?
So women's meaning women's support for a candidate or women on buttons. So, well, I'll do both. Okay, I'll do both. So here, Women for Gore for President 2000, Together We Can Do It, right? Has Rosie the Riveter on it. There is one for Clinton. Women for Clinton Gore 96, Protect Our Gains, right? This is the basically what they used. Purple was the color of women's suffrage, hence the purple background. That is the woman that they used in their advertising and in their efforts to get women to vote. So there are obviously, here's another one. Here's 2 suffragettes with Hillary on the banner. Obviously, this has been photoshopped, that they weren't actually holding her picture back then. It's not, I'm not saying that you can't find them. You can find women for Trump buttons and probably women for Romney and women for McCain. Not a lot. They tend to be Democratic candidates who have women for them buttons. If we talk about women running, obviously, first person to run on a major party ticket, Geraldine Ferraro, went 4. So lots of images with her. A lot of the Democratic support groups, right? Union Labor supports Mondale Ferraro. America is Ready. All women for Mondale in 84. Big push, lots of things, lots of buttons issued with Ferraro on them. It was a big deal because it was, the first time a major party, either president or vice president. Obviously, when Sarah Palin got the nomination, when McCain ran in 2004, we have images of McCain and Palin together. This is a great one. I think beautiful pictures, drawn pictures of both McCain and Palin, along with some of the, it's supposed to be the Republican stalwarts. I really find it humorous that George Washington is on there because, as you know, the Republican Party didn't exist when George Washington was around. So it's funny that he's on there. And then obviously, when Clinton ran, she was first time that a major party presidential candidate was a woman. And so she is depicted on these, wonderful. Here's a repeat design. There were buttons with these, they call them googly eyes. The eyes move. They came out for Hubert Humphrey in 1968, and they redid them for this campaign. So there's one, My Man Trump, that's got the Trump googly eyes, and then My Woman Hillary with the Hillary googly eyes. And then obviously Kamala Harris, she is depicted in these beautiful buttons. This is a Brian Campbell one that I think is really beautiful. It says, I don't know if you can read it, it says Kamala Land, take off on La La Land with her and Joe dancing under the stars.
Couple new questions. Have you considered taking your liberal arts degree full circle and designing a button?
No, I have not.
What is the rarest campaign button ever produced?
Oh, okay. So the rarest campaign button produced is a Jouget. So 2 people depicted on it. Come over here. I don't have one, so don't get excited, gang. And I never will have one because I'll tell you how much it's worth. But it was for this campaign. It was for the 1920 campaign. And if you notice, there are not an awful lot of buttons, and there's no real high design. And the reason is because there wasn't a lot of money, right? The Democrats knew, they were pretty sure that they were going to lose. So they didn't put a lot of money into campaign objects. So the rarest button out there is a Jouget with James Cox, who was the presidential nominee, and his running mate, Franklin Roosevelt. If you can find one, there are 4 or 5 different designs, and there may be 5 or 6 of them in the hobby. They don't come up for auction very often, but if you can find one, it will set you back somewhere between $35,000 and $45,000. That is the rarest button. Now, don't get me wrong. Some of the Harding buttons, some of the John Davis buttons, Davis ran in 24 as a Democrat, exceptionally rare. They are incredibly hard to find. But in terms of the Holy Grail, the button that everybody wants, it would be the Cox Roosevelt Jouget. I want to point one thing out because a lot of folks don't know this. So you see all these little studs and these roosters. It's obviously a play on Cox's name, right? Because these are Cox. But up until this point in time, before the 24 or maybe even the 28 election, the symbol of the Democratic Party was a rooster. It wasn't a donkey. So if you go back, you can see here, Woodrow Wilson, this was a Wilson button that was issued. It's just a picture of a rooster because everybody knew you were a Democrat and you were supporting the Democratic nominee for president. You were supporting Woodrow Wilson. So people think, oh, the 2 symbols, donkey, elephant. Actually, before the late 20s, early 30s, the Democratic symbol was a rooster. I see that we're about 5 minutes till the end. I hope that, I don't know if maybe my camera person wants to take a slow pan of the whole, or wants me to take a, why don't
we see if there's any questions that want
let's see if there's any other questions, and then maybe we'll do a slow pan of the entire collection so you get an idea of the depth and the breadth.
Okay. Maybe mention a pick as a place for collectors.
So there is a group, the American Political Items Collectors, APIC, which is composed of individuals that do this, that collect political memorabilia. It doesn't necessarily have to be buttons. It can be, there's some people who only collect posters, some people who only collect shirts, some people who only collect canes. Anybody who's got the bug and is interested in political items generally belongs to APIC. And they have regional meetings, they have national meetings, they have a newspaper that comes out every month. They have a publication, a glossy magazine called The Keynoter that comes out 4 times a year. It's a great way to connect with other people in the hobby.
What's your favorite funny button?
Oh, my favorite funny button. Okay. I have 2. And I know my mother's watching. Sorry, Mom. I love this one for McGovern just because you got to get up close. And then when you get up close, you're like, oh my goodness. It says liberated ladies like Mcgovern and Shriver, and it's actually a lady with no top on. Back in 1972, that was a risque button to produce. That one I find humorous. Here's my favorite. And this is my favorite because of the sheer brilliance that went into coming up with this. When Barry Goldwater ran in 1964, a lot of the things that were issued for him used the chemical symbols for his last name. AU, which is the chemical symbol for gold, and H2O, which is the chemical symbols for water. So you'll see AuH2O, AuH2O, our next president. Here's a rebus, right? So it's Barry Goldwater. So the Johnson folks were like, okay, we will take advantage of his use of AuH2O. And they came up with a button that says the following. It says C5H4N4O3 on AuH2O. That is the chemical symbols for urine and Goldwater. So that button says in chemical symbols, piss on Goldwater. That someone came up with that, turned the Goldwater AuH2O against him and said, let's find out what the chemical symbol for urine is. And we'll just put out a button that says piss on Goldwater in chemical symbols. That one, to me, takes the cake.
Where did you get most of your buttons from?
Ooh, political button shows, eBay. I would say probably more than half of this collection came from eBay. There are some individuals that have auctions multiple times a year. I've gotten a lot of them through auctions, some from flea markets and antique shops, but not many. You have to be very careful because most of what is sold in antique shops are reproductions or fakes, and so they're not worth anything. So I would say at least half came in from eBay.
And then somebody wants to know, do I have a collection on the main level and can they see that? Do you give tours?
I would give a tour to anybody who wanted to come and see it.
Okay, I think I am done with questions for right now. You want to give a quick?
Yeah, let's. I'll do a quick a flyby because we've hit most of the collection, but I just want to make sure that everybody has an idea of the. So starting with 1896, and then going along. So here is the first election where there were 3 candidates who got electoral votes. There's a whole frame for Teddy Roosevelt. And then we've obviously got 1916, 1920. There's a table in my way, which is why I had to back up a little bit. Here's the second time, 1924. So you'll see there's a whole frame for Robert La Follette. And then going along all the way into the 30s, right? So we have to make a turn now. Took up all of that wall. And we've got into the 40s. And then we've got Eisenhower and Stevenson ran back to back, 52 and 56. They were the Republican and Democratic nominees both times. Then we've got 1960, so John Kennedy, and 64. I got to back up, guys. Sorry, because I got to go around the table again. Here's the last time. There were 3 candidates who got electoral votes. George Wallace has the frame, the third frame all the way over on the right. And then we've got 1972, 1976, and then we have into the 80s. So we've got Reagan and Carter in 80, and then 84, Reagan and Mondale. And then we have to turn the corner again. Hope you guys aren't getting dizzy from this. And we're back still in the 80s. So 88, then 92, 96, 2000. And then we have to go, you see some of my political campaign posters that I have. And then up to the most current elections, right? So we have 2004, 2008, 2012, 2016, and 2020. Now, if you were astute, you might notice that Trump is on top. And I said at the beginning, the collection is winner on top, loser on the bottom. I'm not predicting that Trump was going to win. But in 2016, when I displayed this collection at Monmouth College and I set it up, I had Hillary on top and Trump on the bottom, and I was wrong. So this time I'm going, Trump is the incumbent. He's got the advantage. I put him on top, Biden on the bottom. Maybe on November 4th or 5th or 6th or 7th, whenever we find out who won, I may have to switch. But for right now, that's how I've got
I have two more questions.
Okay.
How can you spot a fake?
Okay. So there's actually so much money in buttons that Congress passed an act in the 1970s that requires anything that's a reproduction to be labeled a reproduction. So it has to say somewhere on it, it's a reproduction. Sometimes they don't put that on there, but they will put the candidate's name on the curl, on the back edge. Well, there's no reason to do that if it's a real button, because you know who the candidate is. That's a clear sign it's a fake. If there are buttons that you know would not have existed, so if you do this long enough, you can pretty much look at one and tell if it's a fake or not without even turning it over. There are some that are called fantasy pieces. So there are buttons made for, Grover Cleveland. Well, buttons didn't exist when Grover Cleveland ran. So you know that that's a fake. Sometimes you can look if the printing is off, if the pictures are fuzzy, you can probably tell that it's a fake, it's a reproduction. Some of them are very good. Some of them are very, very good. And APIC in particular has published a number of pieces about how to spot a fake. I'll be honest with you, when I first started doing this, I had a fair number of fakes in my collection. I've now gone through and weeded them all out. There are no fakes or reproductions. These are all original, 100% original.
What is the most creative button besides MAGA Jesus and Piss on Goldwater?
You got to follow me this way. I keep going back to the election of 1972. So I don't know why this design has not been repeated since then. But again, to me, this is just a incredibly creative button. This button right here from Mcgovern and Shriver, it's literally the two of them cut in half and put together. So the left half of the face is George Mcgovern and the right half of the face is Sergeant Shriver. And if you look at it, you look and you're like, there's something just a little bit off about it, right? It's a person, but it is part of the face in shadow. What is it? It's the fact that they split the candidates in half and then glued them back together. To me, that's creative. And I don't know why. Now, granted, it'd be a little weird to do that with Joe and Kamala, or to do it with Mccain and Palin, or Mondale and Ferraro. That would look a little weird, but you could have done it with some of the others. And so I'm surprised that has not caught on and people have not done that again. That to me is creative. I think the Robin Mcgovern one is exceptionally creative. It's a beautiful drawing of Mcgovern. What the message of that button is. He's gonna redistribute wealth. He's like Robin Hood. He's gonna make things better for the little people. That one to me is another one that's incredibly creative. Trying to think if there's others that really stand out. I do like these. Again, from the Goldwater and Johnson campaign. So Goldwater, his slogan, aside from AUH2O, was "In your heart, you know he's right." And so the Johnson folks came up with "In your guts, you know he's nuts." so again, took his slogan and turned it on him and came up with what I think is probably even catchier: "In your guts, you know he's nuts."
There are no more questions, but there is a happy birthday wish from your mother.
Oh, thank you, Mom. Well, I hope everybody learns a few things about the history of political campaign buttons and how they've been used to tell the story of elections and tell a little bit of background about the candidates. And if anybody has any questions that they think of after this is over, feel free to shoot me an email, or if you have my phone number, give me a call or send me a text, and and I'd be happy to answer them for you. I appreciate you guys spending an evening with me in the run up to this next election, and we'll see what happens.
Brad and Debbie, thank you so much. This has been such a great and quick hour. Like, I think that all of us have more questions. I want to mention that this is recorded. All of our events are recorded and can be found on our website. So I know I will watch it again, and I hope that you all will too. There will be a survey as you leave the webinar. So please, we'd love to hear your ideas for future events. And we just thank you for your time. We thank you for showing up with us tonight. And also we have 6 more events this calendar year. So check out our website, which is very new. If you haven't seen it, monmouthcollege.edu. And we hope to see you at future events. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
And happy birthday.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.